Shalom, my friend. Increase does not slow gradually. It stops quietly without warning. God does not argue with disorder. He simply stops expanding it. You have been functioning. Your responsibilities remain. Your daily operations continue. Yet something fundamental has shifted. The forward momentum that once carried you has vanished. Not collapsed, not reversed, simply absent. This is not about learning what boundaries are. That knowledge precedes this conversation. This is about understanding what happens after they are violated. When the architecture of your life develops structural compromises, heaven responds not with correction, but with containment. The expansion you once experienced was not your right. It was a privilege granted to ordered systems. Today we examine why increase halts when boundaries are breached, why that halt arrives without announcement, and why recognizing this pattern may be the most critical discernment you develop in your adult life. In our previous conversation, we examined thresholds, moments where consequences become irreversible. Today, we examine what happens when boundaries that should have been maintained after a threshold are instead violated. This is not condemnation. It is diagnosis. The first thing you must understand about stagnation is that it masquerades as normalcy. Unlike collapse, which announces itself through crisis, the withdrawal of increase happens silently. Your income may plateau rather than fall. Your influence may stabilize rather than diminish. Your responsibilities may remain constant rather than multiply. This creates a dangerous illusion. You interpret the absence of growth as a season of rest. You frame the lack of expansion as divine patience. You mistake the halt for a pause. But stagnation is not punishment. It is containment being revoked. The God who withdraws increase from compromised structure is the same God who restores increase to repaired structure, but only after order is rebuilt. When God granted you increase in the past, He was not simply blessing your efforts. He was entrusting you with expansion because your structure could contain it. Every promotion, every financial breakthrough, every expansion of influence was heaven's assessment that your boundaries could hold more without compromising the integrity of the whole. But boundaries are not permanent fixtures. They require maintenance. They demand respect. They need consistent reinforcement. When they begin to leak, when they become porous, when they are repeatedly violated, their capacity to contain increase diminishes. Heaven recognizes this degradation before you do. The silence that accompanies this recognition is not cruelty, it is precision. God does not waste expansion on compromised vessels. He does not pour blessing into broken containers. He does not multiply what cannot be sustained. The halt you experience is not divine frustration. It is divine efficiency. Consider the executive who violated personal boundaries to achieve professional success. Late nights became the norm. Family time became negotiable. Personal health became expendable. For a season, this approach generated results. Promotions followed, recognition arrived, authority expanded, but then something changed. Not dramatically, not obviously. The next promotion simply never materialized. The recognition became routine rather than escalating. The authority remained fixed rather than growing. Nothing collapsed. Everything continued functioning, but the trajectory shifted from expansion to maintenance, from multiplication to preservation, from increase to mere sustainability. This pattern reveals something profound about how heaven administers blessing. God does not repair breached structure from above. He does not compensate for compromised boundaries with additional grace. He does not override poor architecture with supernatural intervention. Instead, He withdraws the trust that enabled expansion in the first place. Increase is not a right, it is a stewardship. Blessing is conditional on containment. When that containment fails, blessing does not increase to compensate. It decreases to match your actual capacity. Heaven does not negotiate with leakage. This principle operates across every domain of human experience. The entrepreneur who compromised ethical boundaries to accelerate growth suddenly finds that growth elusive. Opportunities that once appeared regularly become scarce. Partnerships that once formed easily become difficult to establish. Capital that once flowed becomes restricted. The business continues operating, but expansion ceases. The parent who violated relational boundaries to maintain family peace discovers that peace becomes increasingly fragile. Authority that once felt natural becomes forced. Influence that once came easily requires constant effort. Respect that was once given freely must now be demanded. The family continues functioning, but the multiplication of harmony stops. The minister who crossed spiritual boundaries to expand influence finds that influence plateauing. Congregational growth stalls. Speaking invitations decrease. Book sales flatten. Ministry opportunities become repetitive rather than progressive. The work continues, but the advancement halts. In each case, the individual remains operational, but is no longer being trusted with more. This is the most sobering aspect of boundary violation. It does not destroy your current capacity. It simply prevents future expansion. You retain what you have earned, but you forfeit what you could have become. The danger in this dynamic lies in its subtlety. Because nothing breaks, nothing appears wrong. Because current operations continue, current success seems secure. Because immediate consequences are absent, long-term implications remain hidden. You are still functioning, but you are no longer being trusted with more. This creates what we might call the most dangerous state in human development. Not the obvious crisis that demands immediate response, but the quiet plateau that permits comfortable denial. Collapse forces action. Stagnation allows procrastination. Crisis demands change. Plateau permits postponement. Many mistake stillness for patience. They interpret the absence of increase as divine timing rather than divine response to compromised structure. They frame stagnation as preparation rather than consequence. They view the halt as strategic rather than judicial. But nothing is breaking, and that is the warning. When God desires to prepare you for greater responsibility, He typically increases your current responsibilities incrementally. When He wants to develop your capacity, He expands your current opportunities gradually. When He plans promotion, He provides advancement signals progressively. Preparation involves movement, not stillness. Development includes expansion, not limitation. Promotion requires progression, not plateau. But when boundaries have been compromised, when structure has been weakened, when containment has been breached, heaven responds differently, not with additional challenges to strengthen you, but with reduced opportunities to protect the integrity of the whole. Not with increased responsibility to develop you, but with maintained responsibility to prevent further damage. This is why God does not announce withdrawal when increase stops. Warning implies negotiation. Announcement suggests discussion. Declaration invites debate. But the withdrawal of increase is not a negotiation. It is a consequence. It is not a discussion. It is an assessment. It is not a debate, it is a decision. The silence that accompanies this withdrawal serves multiple purposes. First, it forces honest self-examination. When external expansion stops, internal evaluation must begin. When horizontal growth halts, vertical development becomes necessary. When outward blessing ceases, inward reform becomes essential. Second, silence prevents manipulation. If God announced every boundary violation and its consequence, human nature would attempt to negotiate minimal compliance rather than pursue authentic reformation. The warning would become a bargaining chip rather than a call to integrity. Third, silence protects the dignity of the process. Public announcement of withdrawn blessing would humiliate rather than reform. Private recognition of stalled growth preserves the possibility of quiet restoration without public shame. But perhaps most importantly, silence is the signal itself. When you have been accustomed to regular increase, regular expansion, regular advancement, the absence of these becomes unmistakable once you recognize the pattern. Silence becomes the loudest communication. Stillness becomes the clearest message. Stagnation becomes the most obvious consequence. The challenge lies in developing the discernment to recognize withdrawal as consequence rather than timing. Stagnation as response rather than preparation. Plateau as judgment rather than patience. This requires brutal honesty about the correlation between boundary compromises and growth limitations. It demands precise assessment of when increase stopped relative to when boundaries were breached. It necessitates connecting consequences to causes rather than attributing patterns to providence. This discernment is not natural. Human psychology resists connecting current stagnation to past compromises. We prefer to attribute halt to external factors rather than internal failures. We choose to blame circumstances rather than examine structure. We opt to question timing rather than evaluate integrity. But maturity demands different thinking. Responsibility requires cause and effect analysis. Wisdom insists on connecting actions to outcomes, decisions to results, compromises to consequences. The adult recognizes that increase stopped not because heaven changed its mind, but because earth changed its structure. When boundaries become porous, when limits become negotiable, when standards become flexible, the capacity to contain increase diminishes proportionally. This is not punishment, it is physics. Compromised containers cannot hold additional content. Weakened structures cannot support additional weight. Violated boundaries cannot maintain additional blessing. The mathematics are precise. The correlation is exact. The consequence is inevitable. Heaven does not suspend natural law to accommodate compromised character. God does not override structural integrity to maintain artificial expansion. Increase stops where boundaries are ignored, because increase requires boundaries to exist. This creates a sobering reality for anyone experiencing stagnation after a season of growth. The question is not whether God still loves you. Love is constant. The question is not whether God still has plans for you. Plans are eternal. The question is whether your current structure can contain what God desires to give you. Capacity is conditional. If boundaries have been compromised, if limits have been violated, if standards have been lowered, the answer may be no. Not because God has withdrawn his favor, but because you have withdrawn your containment. Not because heaven has changed its mind, but because earth has changed its structure. There is only one direction forward, and it is not negotiable. Increase resumes only where order already exists. Growth returns only where structure has been restored. Expansion continues only where boundaries are respected. But this restoration cannot be negotiated. It cannot be earned through additional effort. It cannot be accelerated through increased activity. Structural restoration requires time. Boundary repair demands patience. Container reinforcement needs consistency. The very qualities that were compromised to achieve rapid expansion must be rebuilt to sustain future growth. The shortcuts that seemed efficient become the detours that prove expensive. The compromises that appeared strategic become the obstacles that prevent advancement. This is why many who recognize the pattern choose to remain in stagnation rather than pursue restoration. The pathway back to increase requires returning to principles they compromise to achieve their current position. It demands rebuilding foundations they undermine to construct their current success. It necessitates strengthening boundaries they weaken to maintain their current comfort. But there is no alternative route. There is no bypass around boundary restoration. There is no shortcut to structural integrity. The same God who blessed your expansion will not negotiate with your compromise. The same heaven that granted increase will not accommodate decreased standards. The same principle that enabled growth will not be suspended to maintain comfort. What makes this particularly sobering is the realization that current functioning can continue indefinitely without increase. You can maintain your current income without expanding it. You can sustain your current influence without multiplying it. You can preserve your current authority without advancing it. Stagnation is stable. Plateau is permanent unless something changes structurally. This permanence creates a false sense of security because nothing is deteriorating, nothing appears urgent, because current success continues, current methods seem validated, because immediate crisis is absent, immediate change appears unnecessary. But maintenance is not increase. Preservation is not multiplication. Sustainability is not expansion. The question becomes whether you can accept a life of maintained blessing rather than multiplied blessing, sustained success rather than expanding success, preserved authority rather than advancing authority. For some, the answer is yes. The cost of restoration appears too high. The effort required seems too great. The changes demanded feel too extensive. But for others, the answer is no. The call to increase is too strong. The vision of multiplication is too compelling. The purpose requiring expansion is too important. For these individuals, stagnation is not acceptable. Plateau is not tolerable. Maintenance is not sufficient. For those who cannot accept limitation, boundary restoration becomes not just advisable, but essential, not as punishment for past compromise, but as preparation for future increase. Not as penance for previous violation, but as prerequisite for coming expansion. Not as judgment for former failure, but as foundation for future success. But restoration cannot be rushed. Boundaries cannot be rebuilt quickly. Structure cannot be reinforced rapidly. The process requires the same patience that was missing when boundaries were first compromised. It demands the same consistency that was absent when limits were first violated. It necessitates the same integrity that was lacking when standards were first lowered. This timeline conflicts with the urgency that drove the original compromises. The desire for rapid results that led to boundary violation resists the patience required for boundary restoration. The impatience that caused structural damage opposes the consistency needed for structural repair. The shortcuts that created the problem resist the slow work required for the solution. Yet there is no alternative. Increase stops where boundaries are ignored, not as temporary inconvenience, but as permanent reality until structure is restored. Heaven does not adapt to compromised character. Character must be rebuilt to receive heavenly blessing. God does not lower his standards to accommodate human weakness. Humans must raise their standards to access divine strength. The silence that accompanies withdrawal withdrawal serves as both consequence and mercy. Consequence because it stops expansion that would cause further damage. Mercy because it prevents collapse that would require more extensive repair. The halt protects both the individual from handling more than their structure can contain, and the kingdom from investing in vessels that cannot hold increase. This protection, though initially frustrating, ultimately proves beneficial. Better to recognize structural limitations before catastrophic failure. Better to address boundary problem before complete collapse. Better to repair containment issues before total destruction. The stagnation you experience may be preventing the disaster you cannot see, but recognition without response leads nowhere. Diagnosis without treatment provides no healing. Awareness without action generates no change. The pattern identified must become the pathway pursued. The consequence recognized must become the catalyst for reform. The judgment accepted must become the motivation for restoration. Your soul is the blueprint. Your life is the construction. Every boundary violation damages the foundation. Every compromised standard weakens the structure. Every lowered limit reduces the capacity. But every restored boundary strengthens the foundation. Every elevated standard reinforces the structure. Every respected limit increases the capacity. The God who stopped expansion because structure was compromised is the same God who will resume expansion when structure is restored. The heaven that withdrew increase because boundaries were violated is the same heaven that will release increase when boundaries are respected. The principle that halted growth because limits were ignored is the same principle that will multiply growth when limits are honored. But timing is not negotiable. Process is not optional. Sequence is not flexible. First restoration, then increase. First repair, then expansion. First structure, then blessing. This order cannot be reversed. This sequence cannot be abbreviated. This process cannot be circumvented. The increase you experienced before boundary violation was not the limit of what heaven desired to give you. It was the limit of what your structure could then contain. When that structure is fully restored, when those boundaries are completely respected, when those limits are consistently honored, increase will resume, not where it stopped, but where it was always intended to go. The stagnation is not the end, it is the pause. Not the conclusion, but the comma. Not the period, but the preparation. But the preparation must be completed before the sentence continues. The pause must serve its purpose before the movement resumes. The halt must accomplish its objective before the advance begins again. Your soul is the blueprint. Your life is the construction. Shalom, my friend. Now let's build the life God designed for you.